Table 12 is for vendors and plus ones who don't really know anyone, Jessica announced with that fake sweet voice she'd perfected since high school, pointing me toward the back corner where the catering staff kept walking by with dirty plates. I stood there in my navy blue dress, invitation trembling slightly in my hand, watching my own cousin Emma laugh with her bridesmaids like I was just another stranger who'd wandered into her perfect day. What they didn't know was that I wasn't. Just family being shoved aside. I was the silent owner of Rosewood Gardens, the very venue they were celebrating in, and I was about to make this wedding unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jane DeLeon, and I want you to imagine something with me. Have you ever been invisible in plain sight, dismissed by the very people who should value you most, all while holding the power to change everything? I was standing in the marble foyer of Rosewood Gardens, the most exclusive wedding venue in Millbrook, watching crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across walls I'd personally chosen the paint color for. The irony wasn't lost on me that in a place where I made dreams come true for strangers every weekend, my own family was treating me like an unwelcome guest. Let me back up and tell you how I got here, because this story starts long before Emma's wedding day. 3 years ago, I was working as an event coordinator for a corporate company, organizing boring conferences and retirement parties that nobody really wanted to attend. I was good at it, maybe too good, because I kept dreaming bigger than the beige hotel ballrooms and rubber chicken dinners my boss kept assigning me. That's when I met Michael Chen, a real estate developer who'd been sitting on this gorgeous, old estate property for 2 years, unable to figure out what to do with it. The property was called Rosewood Gardens, a stunning Victorian mansion surrounded by manicured gardens and ancient oak trees that had been in the same family for generations. The elderly owner had passed away, and her children lived out of state, and just wanted it sold. Michael had bought it thinking he'd tear it down and build condos, but the Historical Society had blocked him at every turn. When I first walked through those French doors onto the garden terrace, I knew exactly what the property was meant to be. I pitched him the idea over coffee at a little cafe downtown, spreading out sketches and mood boards I'd been working on, in secret for months. A luxury wedding venue, I told him, somewhere brides would drive hours to book, where every photo would look like a magazine spread. I had the vision, the connections in the wedding industry, and the passion to make it work. What I didn't have was money. That's where Michael came in with an offer that changed everything. He'd provide all the capital for renovations, permits, and startup costs. I'd handle every aspect of the design, marketing, and operations. We'd split ownership 50-50. But here's the part that seemed genius at the time. I would be the silent partner. Michael's name would be on all the public documents, the business licenses, the marketing materials. My family had always been skeptical of my career choices, calling event planning playing party planner, and suggesting I get a real job with benefits and a pension. I didn't want to deal with their opinions or their inevitable requests for family discounts and free venue rentals. For 2 years, Michael and I poured everything into transforming Rosewood Gardens. I spent weekends covered in paint dust, worked with contractors and landscapers, tasted hundreds of catering samples, and interviewed every florist in a 50-mile radius. We turned the old conservatory into a breathtaking ceremony space with floor-to-ceiling windows and trailing ivy. The grand ballroom became our heritage room, with restored hardwood floors that gleamed under the original crystal chandeliers we'd had professionally cleaned and rewired. The garden terrace became my masterpiece, with string lights woven through the oak branches, a stone fountain we'd had restored to working condition, and garden beds bursting with white roses and lavender. Every corner of that property reflected my vision, my taste, my countless hours of work. When Millbrook magazine featured us as the wedding venue that's redefining elegant in their spring issue, I felt prouder than I'd ever felt about anything in my life. But my family didn't know any of this. To them, I was still Jane who worked somewhere in events and lived in a modest apartment downtown. I never corrected them when they assumed I was just another coordinator working for other people. I kept my business casual when they asked about work, mentioning venues and weddings without ever saying which ones were mine. It felt safer that way, like protecting something precious from people who wouldn't understand its value. The venue became successful beyond our wildest projections. We were booked solid 18 months out, with a waiting list of brides desperate for cancellations. Our weekend rates started at $15,000, and our signature Rosewood experience package was triple that. I was making more money than I'd ever dreamed of, but I lived modestly, reinvesting most of my profits back into the business and saving the rest. That's when Emma got engaged to David last fall. I was genuinely happy for her, despite the fact that we'd never been particularly close. Emma was Aunt Patricia and Uncle Robert's golden child, the one who'd gone to law school and married another lawyer and lived in a house with a 3-car garage in the suburbs. Our family gatherings usually involved a lot of Emma showing off her latest vacation photos or expensive handbag, while I nodded politely and tried to avoid questions about my own life. When Emma announced her engagement at Thanksgiving dinner, she immediately launched into wedding planning talk. She'd looked at 6 venues already, she told us, each one more disappointing than the last. Too small, too outdated, too expensive, too far from the city. She wanted somewhere magical, she said, somewhere that would photograph beautifully and make all her friends jealous. Aunt Patricia suggested several places she'd heard about, including Rosewood Gardens. I nearly choked on my stuffing when Emma wrinkled her nose and said, "Oh, I looked at their website. It's pretty, but it's probably way out of our budget. Places like that are for people with serious money." She said it with that particular tone that suggested people like us don't get to have nice things, a tone I'd heard my whole life whenever someone in the family had big dreams or expensive tastes. That's when I made my first mistake. I offered to help. Not as the owner, just as someone who worked in the industry and might have connections. I told Emma I'd make some calls, see if I could get her a tour at some of the more exclusive venues in the area. She looked surprised that I might actually be useful for something, and Aunt Patricia patted my hand condescendingly and said, "That's so sweet of you to try to help, dear." I called Michael that Monday morning, and we arranged for Emma and David to tour Rosewood Gardens the following weekend. I told him to give them the full VIP treatment but not to mention my involvement. I wanted to see how they'd react to the venue on its own merits, without the complication of family dynamics. Michael agreed, though he thought I was being unnecessarily secretive. The tour went perfectly. Emma called me that evening, breathless, with excitement. "Jane, you were right about having connections," she gushed. "Rosewood Gardens is absolutely stunning. It's like something out of a fairy tale. The owner even gave us a significant discount because you referred us. We're booking it for next October." I should have told her then. I should have explained that the discount was me choosing to give my own cousin a family rate, that the reason the tour went so smoothly was because I'd personally trained every staff member who walked them through the property. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But I didn't. I was enjoying the rare experience of Emma being grateful to me, of being seen as someone who could make things happen. So I just said I was happy I could help and asked her to keep me posted on the planning. Over the next few months, Emma would call me occasionally with wedding updates. She'd found the perfect dress. David had picked his groomsmen. They were going with a vintage romantic theme that would be perfect for the venue's aesthetic. She never asked about my involvement beyond that initial referral, and I never brought it up. I told myself I was keeping things simple, avoiding unnecessary complications. Meanwhile, I was intimately involved in planning her wedding from the business side. Michael handled the initial contracts and payments, but I was designing the setup, coordinating with the vendors, and ensuring every detail would be perfect. I chose the linens, approved the floral arrangements, and personally tested the menu they'd selected. It felt strange to be planning Emma's dream wedding while pretending to have nothing to do with it, but I convinced myself it was for the best. As the wedding approached, I started to feel excited about finally attending an event at my own venue as a guest, rather than the coordinator. I'd be able to see Rosewood Gardens through different eyes, to experience the magic I'd created from the other side. I bought a beautiful navy blue dress and planned to surprise Emma with how elegant everything would look. That's when the first red flag appeared. 2 weeks before the wedding, Emma called me with what she described as a tiny logistics issue. She and David had been going over the final guest count, and they were a few seats over capacity for their preferred table arrangement. Would I mind terribly, she asked, if they put me at one of the smaller tables with some of David's work colleagues and their plus ones? It's not that you're not important, she assured me quickly. It's just that you don't really know most of our friends, and we thought you might be more comfortable with the other single people who don't know anyone. The way she said other single people made it clear that she saw me as someone who didn't quite fit with the main crowd, someone whose seating assignment was more about logistics than love. I agreed, because what else was I supposed to say? That as the venue owner, I should probably be seated somewhere more prominent? That seemed petty and would require explanations I wasn't ready to give. So I told Emma not to worry about it, that I'd be fine wherever she put me. But the table assignment bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I'd helped create the space where Emma would have her perfect day. I'd given her a substantial discount on a venue she never could have afforded otherwise, and she was treating me like a distant acquaintance who might not mesh well with her real friends. It felt like a preview of how the rest of the family saw me, useful when they needed something, invisible when they didn't. The second red flag came a few days later. During the final walkthrough, I always attended final walkthroughs for major events, partly to ensure everything was perfect, and partly because I genuinely loved seeing how our couples reacted to their finished setup. Emma and David arrived with Aunt Patricia, Uncle Robert, and Jessica, who'd apparently appointed herself the unofficial wedding coordinator. I watched from the office window as Michael gave them the tour, showing off the ceremony setup in the conservatory and the reception layout in the heritage room. Emma was glowing, pointing out details to her parents and taking photos of everything. But when Michael mentioned that the venue's silent partner had personally overseen many of the custom details for their wedding, Emma just nodded absently and asked about the timeline for the bar service. The silent partner. That was me. I'd personally chosen the vintage-inspired gold chargers for their table settings, selected the specific variety of garden roses for their centerpieces, and approved the custom lighting design that would make their first dance look like something out of a movie. But to Emma, I was just some invisible business person she'd never meet, someone whose contributions didn't warrant even a moment's curiosity. Standing in that office, watching my own family tour the venue I'd built while treating me like I was irrelevant, something shifted inside me. For the first time, I started to wonder what would happen if they knew the truth. Not in a warm family revelation kind of way, but in a way that might make them reconsider how they'd been treating me. The wedding day arrived crisp and clear. Perfect October weather with golden sunlight streaming through the conservatory windows and a gentle breeze rustling the oak leaves on the terrace. I arrived early, ostensibly as a guest, but really to do my final check that everything was perfect. The flowers were stunning, the heritage room was set up exactly to specification, and the catering team was running through their timeline with military precision. I'd spent extra time getting ready that morning, choosing accessories that complemented my navy dress and taking care with my makeup. I wanted to look sophisticated, like someone who belonged at an elegant wedding rather than someone who'd been grudgingly invited out of family obligation. When I walked into the venue, I felt confident and proud. This was my place, my creation, and I was finally going to experience it as a celebration rather than work. But confidence can be fragile, and mine shattered the moment I approached the Guest check-in table. The young woman Michael had hired to handle seating looked at my name on the list and frowned slightly before handing me a table card. Table 12, she said with a professional smile. That's in the back corner, near the catering station. Table 12 wasn't just in the back corner. It was practically in a different room, positioned where the catering staff would be constantly walking by with trays and dirty dishes. The other tables in that section were clearly for vendors, plus ones who didn't know anyone, and what looked like David's college roommates who'd been given obligatory invitations. This wasn't just poor seating. This was exile. I stood there, holding my table card, feeling the familiar sting of being dismissed by people who should have valued me. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't just Jane, the family disappointment who worked somewhere in events. I was Jane DeLeon, co-owner of the venue they were celebrating in, the person whose vision and work had created every beautiful detail they'd be photographing and bragging about for years to come. That's when Jessica appeared beside me, resplendent, in her maid of honor dress, and clearly enjoying her role as Emma's right hand. Table 12 is for vendors and plus ones who don't really know anyone, she announced with that fake sweet voice, not even bothering to lower her tone. Emma thought you'd be more comfortable there since you're not really part of the main wedding party crowd. Not part of the main wedding party crowd. I was Emma's cousin, her family, someone who'd helped make this entire day possible in ways she couldn't even imagine. But to them, I was just an awkward obligation, someone to stick in the corner where I wouldn't interfere with their perfect photos or sophisticated conversation. I looked around the heritage room, at the crystal chandeliers I'd personally selected, the hardwood floors I'd watched being restored plank by plank, the garden doors that opened onto the terrace where I'd spent countless hours perfecting the landscaping. This wasn't just a venue to me. It was my life's work, my creative vision made real. And they'd relegated me to the table where the DJ's girlfriend and the photographer's assistant would be sitting. Standing there in my navy dress, holding a table card that felt like a rejection letter, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to quietly accept this dismissal. I wasn't going to smile and pretend it didn't hurt. For once in my life, I was going to let my family learn exactly who they'd been underestimating. But first, I was going to sit at table 12 and watch them celebrate in the venue I'd built, surrounded by the beauty I'd created, completely unaware that the woman they'd just humiliated was the reason any of this existed at all. Sometimes the best revenge starts with perfect patience, and I had been patient for far too long. Part 2. The breaking point and decision. I walked to table 12 with my chin up and my shoulders straight, refusing to let Jessica see how deeply her casual cruelty had cut. The table was exactly as disappointing as I'd expected, wobbly, positioned directly in the path of the catering staff, and populated by people who looked as confused about their placement as I felt insulted by mine. There was Marcus, David's college roommate who'd driven down from Boston and clearly didn't know anyone beyond the groom. Sarah, a plus one who kept checking her phone and picking at the centerpiece. And Tom, who I quickly realized was the backup, photographer's assistant, here to help carry equipment and grab candid shots during dinner. As I settled into my assigned seat, I watched the main tables filling up with Emma's sorority sisters, David's law firm colleagues, and various family members who apparently warranted better treatment than the cousin who'd made this entire venue possible. Aunt Patricia was holding court at table 3, already regaling the other guests with stories about Emma's law school achievements. Uncle Robert was schmoozing with David's father at the head table, discussing golf handicaps and stock portfolios. Everyone looked perfectly placed, perfectly comfortable, perfectly aware of their importance in this celebration. The ceremony began 20 minutes later in the conservatory, and I had to admit it was breathtaking. The October sunlight streaming through the glass walls created an almost ethereal glow around Emma as she walked down the aisle between the white rose arrangements I'd personally approved. The string quartet played flawlessly from their position near the restored fountain, and the vintage-inspired arch David stood beneath was adorned with the exact combination of garden roses and eucalyptus I'd recommended to the florist. Watching Emma say her vows in the space I'd designed, I felt a complex mixture of pride and bitterness. This was my vision brought to life, my artistic sensibility creating the backdrop for what would undoubtedly be the most photographed day of Emma's life. Yet I was experiencing it from the perspective of an unwelcome outsider, someone whose contribution was so invisible that my own family had literally seated me with strangers. During the cocktail hour on the garden terrace, I found myself observing the event with the dual perspective of a rejected family member and a secret business owner. The staff was performing flawlessly, circulating with the artisanal appetizers I'd helped select from dozens of tastings. The bartenders were crafting the signature cocktails Emma and David had chosen from our premium menu, using the top-shelf liquors that came standard with our highest-tier package. Every detail was executing exactly as I'd planned it, creating an atmosphere of effortless elegance that would make Emma's friends talk about this wedding for years. But instead of mingling with the other guests, I found myself gravitating toward the edges of the gathering, half hidden behind the oak trees I'd had professionally pruned to create perfect photo opportunities. From this vantage point, I could see everything while remaining largely invisible, a position that felt metaphorically appropriate for how my family had always treated me. That's when I overheard the conversation that changed everything. Emma was standing near the fountain with 3 of her bridesmaids, champagne flutes in hand, taking selfies against the backdrop of trailing ivy and string lights. I was close, enough to hear their conversation, but hidden enough that they had no idea I was listening. "Emma, this place is absolutely incredible," gushed one of the bridesmaids, a blonde woman whose dress probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. "How did you even find it? It's like something from a magazine." Emma preened visibly, adjusting her veil with practiced precision. "Oh, it took forever to book. This place is supposed to be impossible to get into. They're booked solid for like 2 years in advance. But David's family has connections, and we managed to pull some strings." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Plus, my cousin Jane knows someone in the wedding industry who got us a discount. She's not really successful or anything, but sometimes having family who work service jobs comes in handy." Service jobs. I felt the blood drain from my face as Emma continued her casual character assassination. "Jane's the one sitting with the random people in the back," Emma added with a dismissive wave toward table 12. "We had to put her somewhere, obviously, since she's family, but she doesn't really fit in with our crowd. She's sweet, but you know how it is with some people. They just never quite figure out how to make something of themselves." The bridesmaids nodded sympathetically, as if my perceived failure in life was a sad but predictable family burden Emma had to bear with grace. One of them even made a little tutting sound, like I was a rescue dog who couldn't quite be housebroken. "It's actually kind of embarrassing," Emma continued, warming to her theme. "She's in her 30s and still single, still working these little event planning jobs that don't really lead anywhere. Mom feels sorry for her, so we try to include her in family stuff. But honestly, what do you even talk about with someone who's never traveled anywhere interesting or accomplished anything meaningful?" I pressed myself back against the oak tree, my hands shaking slightly as I listened to my own cousin reduce my life to a series of failures and disappointments. The woman who was celebrating her wedding in the venue I'd created, using the discount I'd given her, surrounded by the beauty I'd spent 2 years bringing to life, was describing me as a charity case whose greatest achievement was knowing someone who could save her money. The worst part is that she probably thinks this is like the fanciest thing she's ever been to, added another bridesmaid, and they all laughed. The kind of knowing, exclusive laugh that makes it clear you're the punchline of a joke you didn't know was being told. I stood there for a long moment, letting their words sink in like poison in my bloodstream. This wasn't just casual dismissal or thoughtless family dynamics. This was deliberate, calculated diminishment from someone who was actively benefiting from my generosity while publicly humiliating me. Emma hadn't just stuck me at table 12 out of logistical necessity. She'd done it because she genuinely believed I belonged there, with the people who didn't matter, the ones whose presence was tolerated rather than celebrated. But what cut deepest wasn't the cruelty of her words. It was the accuracy of her assumption. She was right that this was probably the fanciest event I'd ever attended as a guest. What she didn't know was that it was fancy because I'd made it that way, because every elegant detail she was bragging about had come from my vision and my work. She was using my success as evidence of my failure, and the irony was so sharp it took my breath away. I pulled out my phone and opened the recording app, a habit I'd developed during the venue's construction when I needed to document conversations with contractors and vendors. My finger hovered over the record button as Emma continued her performance, for her friends. "I mean, I love her, obviously, because she's family," Emma was saying with the kind of patronizing tone reserved for discussing mentally challenged pets. "But you can't help someone who doesn't want to help themselves, you know? Jane's just one of those people who's content with mediocrity. She doesn't have any real ambitions or dreams. She's probably perfectly happy with her little apartment and her little job. And who are we to judge that?" I pressed record and slipped the phone back into my purse, my decision crystallizing with the click of the button. Emma wanted to treat me like someone whose life was too small to matter. She was about to learn exactly how large my life really was. The cocktail hour ended, and we all moved back into the Heritage Room for dinner. I took my seat at table 12, but this time I wasn't viewing my placement as a humiliation. I was seeing it as a strategic advantage. From my position in the back corner, I could observe the entire reception without being noticed, could watch my family enjoy the fruits of my labor while planning exactly how to reveal the truth. Marcus, the college roommate to my left, was making conversation about the beautiful venue and asking if I knew anything about the history of the property. I found myself giving him a detailed tour of the restoration process, describing the work that had gone into preserving the original architectural details while modernizing the infrastructure. He listened with genuine interest, occasionally asking thoughtful questions about the design choices and commenting on specific elements he found particularly impressive. "You know a lot about this place," he observed after I'd explained the story behind the conservatory's restored stained glass panels. "Are you in the wedding industry?" "You could say that," I replied, and for the first time all day I allowed myself a small smile. I'm very familiar with how venues like this operate. As dinner was served, I watched the seamless choreography of the catering staff I'd personally trained, presenting the courses I'd helped develop during months of menu tastings. The herb-crusted salmon with lemon risotto was perfectly executed, the seasonal vegetables were cooked exactly as I'd specified, and the wine pairings I'd approved with our sommelier were complementing each course beautifully. Every element of the meal reflected my standards and my attention to detail, yet Emma and her guests were experiencing it as if it had materialized through magic or David's supposed family connections. During the main course, I excused myself to use the restroom, but instead of heading to the guest facilities, I walked through the service corridor to the venue's private office. Michael was there, going over the evening's timeline with our event coordinator, Lisa. They both looked up in surprise when I entered. "Jane," Michael said, standing up from behind the desk. "I didn't expect to see you back here tonight. How's the wedding going? Everything running smoothly?" "The wedding is flawless," I said, closing the door behind me. "Your staff has outdone themselves as usual. But I need to ask you something, and I need complete honesty. When Emma and David booked this venue, what exactly did you tell them about the ownership structure?" Michael looked puzzled by the question. "I followed your instructions exactly. I said that the venue had a silent partner who preferred to remain anonymous, and that the discount was being offered as a professional courtesy through your referral. I made it clear that you had significant influence with the venue's decision-makers, without revealing that you are one of the decision makers. Why? Has something gone wrong? Nothing's gone wrong with the event, I said carefully. But I'm reconsidering the anonymous part of our arrangement. How difficult would it be to make my ownership position public starting tonight? Lisa's eyes widened slightly, and Michael leaned back in his chair, studying my face with concern. Jane, what's happened? You've been adamant about keeping your involvement private. Your family doesn't even know you own this place. That's exactly the problem, I said, and I could hear the edge creeping into my voice. My family doesn't know I own this place, so they're treating me like someone whose life is too insignificant to matter. They've seated me with strangers. Emma's been describing me to her friends as a charity case with no real accomplishments, and they're all celebrating in the space I created while acting like I'm lucky to be invited. Michael was quiet for a moment, processing the implications of what I was telling him. So, you want to reveal your ownership tonight? During Emma's wedding? I want to stop being invisible, I said firmly. I want to stop letting people treat me like my contributions don't matter when I'm literally the reason this night is possible. Emma thinks David's family connections got them this venue, and she's been bragging about it all evening. I think it's time for some truth. Lisa cleared her throat delicately. If you don't mind me asking, what exactly are you planning to do? Because we have protocols for handling family drama during events, and most of them involve containing the situation rather than escalating it. I considered her question carefully. What was I planning to do? I could march back to the reception and announce my ownership in front of everyone, creating the kind of scene that would overshadow Emma's entire wedding. I could pull my cousin aside and reveal the truth privately, allowing her to save face, while understanding exactly how badly she'd misjudged me. Or I could wait until after the wedding and let the revelation unfold more strategically, with maximum impact and minimum collateral damage to the other guests. I'm not going to ruin Emma's wedding, I said finally. That would make me exactly as cruel as she's been. But I am going to make sure she understands exactly what she's done and exactly who she's been underestimating. Can you pull up the financials records for this event? I want to review exactly what discount we gave them and what the true cost would have been. Michael turned to his laptop and pulled up the booking file. They paid $18,000 for the Rosewood Experience package, which normally runs $32,000. You approved a family discount of 44%, which saved them just over $14,000. $14,000. I'd saved Emma and David $14,000, making it possible for them to afford a venue that was, in Emma's own words, supposed to be impossible to get into. Without my generosity, they would have been celebrating in some suburban hotel ballroom with fluorescent lighting and a cash bar. Instead, they were enjoying a luxury experience that would be the envy of everyone they knew, and Emma was using my perceived failure as entertainment for her bridesmaids. Can you print out a detailed breakdown of what they actually paid versus what they would have paid without the family discount? I asked. And can you include a comparison to what their second-choice venues would have cost them? Of course, Michael said, already pulling up the relevant documents. But Jane, are you sure about this? Once you reveal your involvement, there's no going back to being the anonymous partner. Your family will know exactly how successful you've been, and they'll know you've been keeping it from them. That's going to raise questions about trust and honesty that might be harder to answer than you think. He was right, and I knew it. Revealing my ownership of Rosewood Gardens would open up years of questions about why I'd hidden my success, why I'd let them treat me like someone whose career was going nowhere, why I'd never corrected their assumptions about my financial situation. But as I sat in that office, listening to the distant sounds of laughter and music from the reception where my own family was celebrating without valuing me, I realized I was tired of protecting other people's comfort at the expense of my own dignity. Print the documents, I said. And can you also pull up the guest reviews and press coverage we've received? I want Emma to understand exactly what kind of venue she thinks David's connections got them access to. While Michael prepared the paperwork, I stepped out onto the small balcony that overlooked the garden terrace. The reception was in full swing now, with guests mingling on the terrace between the heritage room and the conservatory. The string lights I'd designed were casting a warm glow over the entire scene, and the fountain I'd had restored was providing the perfect ambient soundtrack to the evening. It was exactly the kind of magical atmosphere I'd envisioned when I first walked through this property 3 years ago. From my elevated position, I could see Emma and David posing for photos with various family members and friends. They looked radiant and happy, completely absorbed in their perfect day. Part of me felt guilty for planning to disrupt that happiness, but a larger part of me was tired of being expected to sacrifice my own dignity to preserve other people's comfortable illusions. I pulled out my phone and listened to the recording I'd made during cocktail hour. Emma's voice clear and dismissive as she described my life as a series of disappointments and missed opportunities. She's sweet, but you know how it is with some people. They just never quite figure out how to make something of themselves. The casual cruelty of it still took my breath away. When I returned to the office, Michael had prepared a comprehensive folder with every document I'd requested. The financial breakdown showed not just the discount Emma had received, but comparisons to 3 other venues she'd toured, all of which would have cost more than what she'd paid even with our family rate. The press coverage included the Millbrook magazine feature that had called us the wedding venue that's redefining elegant, along with 5-star reviews from satisfied couples and recognition from 2 major wedding industry publications. "This is everything you asked for," Michael said, handing me the folder. "But I want you to think carefully about how you use it. Emma may have hurt your feelings, but publicly humiliating someone at their own wedding is nuclear-level retaliation. Are you prepared for the fallout from your entire family?" I looked down at the folder in my hands, weighing the satisfaction of finally being seen against the chaos that revelation would inevitably bring. My family had always been comfortable, with our established dynamic, Emma as the successful one, me as the one who tried hard but never quite measured up. Disrupting that narrative wouldn't just change how they saw me, it would force them to confront how wrong they'd been about me for years. "I'm not going to embarrass her in front of her wedding guests," I said finally, "but I am going to make sure she knows exactly who made this night possible. She wants to treat me like someone whose life doesn't matter. She's going to learn exactly how much her perfect wedding depended on the person she decided wasn't worth a decent seat." The band was starting their first set when I returned to the reception, and couples were beginning to move onto the dance floor for the opening songs. I remained at table 12, but now I was no longer hiding in the back. I was strategically positioned to observe and plan. Marcus was telling Sarah about his startup company, and Tom was showing them both some of the candid photos he'd captured during dinner. It was actually a pleasant table of people who'd been dismissed as unimportant, and I found myself wondering how many other events I'd attended where the most interesting conversations were happening at the tables the hosts had written off. As Emma and David took the floor for their first dance, I watched them move together under the lights I'd chosen, surrounded by the floral arrangements I'd approved, dancing to music played by the band I'd helped select. Everything they would remember about this night, everything their guests would praise and their photographer would capture, had been influenced by my vision and my work. Yet I was experiencing it as an outsider, someone whose presence was tolerated rather than valued. But not for much longer. Emma had made her choice about how to treat me, and she'd made it publicly, in front of her friends, using my perceived failures as entertainment. Now it was time for her to learn exactly what those failures actually were, and exactly whose success had made her perfect wedding possible. I slipped the folder Michael had prepared into my purse and settled back in my chair to watch the rest of the reception unfold. Tomorrow, Emma would wake up as a newlywed with beautiful memories of her dream wedding. But she would also wake up to the truth about exactly who had made that dream come true, and exactly how badly she had misjudged the cousin she'd decided wasn't worth respecting. The breaking point had been reached. The decision had been made. Now it was time to stop being invisible and start being impossible to ignore. Part 3. The Execution and Escalation. The first dance ended to enthusiastic applause, and I watched Emma beam as David spun her one final time before other couples joined them on the floor. Aunt Patricia was dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Uncle Robert was raising his champagne glass in a toast to no one in particular, and the entire heritage room was glowing with the kind of warm celebration that made my heart ache for what this night could have been. But instead of wallowing in that disappointment, I was feeling something else entirely. A crystalline clarity about exactly what needed to happen next. I excused myself from table 12, telling Marcus I was going to get some air, and made my way through the side entrance to the venue's administrative wing. The hallway was quiet except for the distant sound of music and laughter from the reception, and I felt like I was moving between two different worlds. The celebration where I was invisible, and the business where I was in complete control. My first stop was the catering coordinator's station, where Lisa was monitoring the evening service timeline. She looked up from her clipboard when I approached, her expression still concerned from our earlier conversation in the office. "How are you holding up?" she asked quietly. "I know tonight has been difficult." "I'm fine," I said, and for the first time all evening I meant it. "But I need to ask a favor. For the cake-cutting ceremony, I want you to position the photographer to capture the heritage room from the entrance perspective. Make sure the shot includes the crystal chandelier and the garden doors in the background." Lisa made a note on her timeline sheet. "Any particular reason for the specific angle?" "Documentation purposes," I said simply. "I want comprehensive photos of how the venue looks during peak celebration, the kind of images that would be useful for marketing materials or press coverage." She nodded without asking further questions, which was one of the reasons I'd promoted her to head coordinator. Lisa understood that sometimes business decisions required information that wouldn't make sense until later, and she executed instructions with professional discretion. My next stop was the bar station on the terrace, where our head bartender, James, was crafting cocktails for the outdoor portion of the reception. I'd hired James from a high-end hotel in the city, and his expertise had elevated our beverage service to the point where couples specifically requested him for their events. "James," I said, approaching the bar as he finished shaking a craft, "cocktail for one of David's groomsmen. I need you to prepare something special for me. Do we still have that bottle of Dom Perignon that the Morrison wedding left behind last month?" He nodded, reaching for the premium champagne we kept in reserve for special occasions. "The 2010 vintage? That's a $400 bottle?" "Perfect," I said. "I want you to present it to table 12 in about 20 minutes with your compliments as the venue's head bartender. Tell them it's a gesture of appreciation for being such gracious guests." James looked puzzled, but began preparing the presentation. "Should I mention anything specific about the selection?" "Just that it's from the venue's private reserve, and that we occasionally share special bottles with guests who truly appreciate the craftsmanship that goes into creating memorable experiences." I handed him a business card from my purse, not my personal card, but one of the official Rosewood Gardens cards that listed me as co-owner. "If anyone asks questions about the gesture, give them this and tell them the ownership felt they deserved recognition." Understanding flickered in James's eyes as he looked at the card. He'd been working at Rosewood Gardens for over a year, but like most of our staff, he'd only ever interacted with Michael in any official capacity. Seeing my name on an ownership card was clearly connecting dots he hadn't previously been able to connect. "I'll take care of it personally," he said, slipping the card into his vest pocket. 20 minutes, table 12, with the full presentation. I thanked him and continued my circuit through the venue, making strategic adjustments to the evening service that would subtly establish my authority without disrupting Emma's celebration. At the floral station, I instructed our designer to prepare a special arrangement for table 12, white roses and eucalyptus in a crystal vase, the same combination used in Emma's bridal bouquet, but elevated with premium flowers from our private reserve. Each gesture was carefully calculated to signal my position at the venue without creating obvious disruption. The guests at table 12 would begin receiving VIP treatment that was clearly coming from management level, not standard service. Meanwhile, the main reception would continue exactly as planned, with Emma and her family completely unaware that anything unusual was happening. As I completed my rounds through the service areas, I felt the familiar satisfaction of orchestrating a complex event where every detail worked in harmony. This was what I was genuinely good at, not just planning parties, as Emma had dismissively described it to her friends, but creating experiences where dozens of moving parts came together to produce something magical. The irony that I was using these skills to methodically dismantle my cousin's assumptions about my capabilities wasn't lost on me. I returned to table 12, just as James was approaching with the Dom Perignon presentation. He moved with the practiced elegance I'd trained into all our staff, carrying the bottle on a silver tray with crystal flutes and presenting it with a slight bow. "Good evening," he said to our table with genuine warmth. "I'm James, the head bartender here at Rosewood Gardens. The venue's ownership has asked me to present this Dom Perignon 2010 as a token of appreciation for being such wonderful guests tonight. We occasionally share bottles from our private reserve with visitors who truly understand and appreciate the artistry that goes into creating exceptional experiences." Marcus looked stunned as James began the ceremonial opening of the champagne. "This is incredibly generous," he said. "We haven't done anything special to deserve this kind of treatment." "The ownership disagrees," James replied smoothly, pouring the golden champagne into crystal flutes. "Sometimes the most appreciative guests are the ones who notice details that others might overlook. Your table has been observed having genuinely engaging conversations about the venue's design and restoration process, which means a great deal to the people who created this space." Sarah raised her flute with obvious delight. "I've never had champagne this expensive in my life. This is like a once-in-a-lifetime experience." Tom, the photographer's assistant, was examining the bottle with professional interest. "The presentation alone is worth photographing. This level of service is definitely not standard. Someone very high up must have specifically requested this." I sipped my champagne and smiled, watching my table mates experience the kind of thoughtful hospitality that had made Rosewood Gardens famous among discerning couples. Meanwhile, across the room, Emma and her bridal party were enjoying the standard premium service that came with their package. Excellent by any measure, but nothing that would make them feel particularly distinguished from any other wealthy couple celebrating at an upscale venue. The floral arrangement arrived 15 minutes later, delivered by our head designer with the same ceremonial attention James had shown with the champagne. "The venue's management wanted to present this special arrangement to your table," she explained, setting down the crystal vase filled with the premium roses. "These are from the same batch used in tonight's bridal bouquet, but we've selected the most perfect blooms and added elements from our exclusive garden collection." Marcus was shaking his head in amazement. "I feel like we've accidentally wandered into some kind of VIP experience. This is extraordinary." "It's not accidental," I said quietly, and the entire table turned to look at me. Sometimes the people who deserve recognition are sitting exactly where they're supposed to be. Before anyone could ask what I meant by that cryptic comment, the band announced that Emma and David would be cutting their wedding cake. The entire reception moved toward the dessert station, where a 3-tier creation covered in sugar flowers and delicate piping was waiting to be ceremonially destroyed. I followed the crowd, positioning myself where I could observe both the cake cutting and the reaction of my table mates to their unexpected VIP treatment. Emma looked radiant as she and David posed with the silver cake server, laughing as the photographer captured every angle of the traditional moment. The cake itself was a work of art. Vanilla bean layers with raspberry filling and Swiss buttercream frosting, decorated with sugar work that perfectly complemented the venue's garden aesthetic. I'd been intimately involved in selecting both the baker and the specific design, though Emma had no idea that her perfect cake had been influenced by my taste and expertise. As Emma made the first cut, I noticed Lisa positioning the photographer exactly as I'd requested, capturing the moment with the Heritage Room's architectural details prominently displayed in the background. The resulting photos would show not just the happy couple, but the stunning venue that had made their celebration possible, documentation that would be useful for what I was planning next. After the cake cutting, guests began to disperse again, some returning to the dance floor, while others moved to the terrace for more cocktails and conversation. I used the natural break in festivities to check my phone, where I found a text message from Michael that made my pulse quicken with anticipation. Emma's parents just asked me about booking the venue for their anniversary party next year. They want to know if we can give them the same family discount you arranged for the wedding. Should I tell them you'll need to approve any special rates? Perfect. Uncle Robert and Aunt Patricia were already trying to leverage what they assumed was my minor connection to get themselves a better deal, having no idea that their connection was actually the venue's co-owner. This was exactly the kind of presumptuous behavior that had characterized their treatment of me for years, assuming I existed primarily to provide them with benefits while offering nothing meaningful in return. I texted back, "Tell them any future family bookings will need to be discussed directly with ownership. Ask them to submit a formal request in writing, including details about their expectations for pricing and service level." The response would force Uncle Robert and Aunt Patricia to put their assumptions about my influence in writing, creating a paper trail of their expectations that I could address directly when I revealed my actual position. More importantly, it would make them start thinking seriously about the value of the connection they'd been taking for granted. 20 minutes later, Michael approached table 12 directly, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the kind of serious expression that indicated official business. The conversation at our table stopped as he addressed the group with formal courtesy. "Good evening, everyone. I'm Michael Chen, the managing partner here at Rosewood Gardens. I hope you're all enjoying the celebration tonight." He turned to me specifically. "Ms. de Leon, could I speak with you privately about a business matter? There's been a development that requires your immediate attention." The entire table stared as I stood up, smoothing my navy dress and following Michael toward the venue's main office. I could feel their eyes on my back, confusion and curiosity radiating from my table mates as they tried to process why the venue's managing partner needed to conduct urgent business with the woman they'd assumed was just another random wedding guest. In the office, Michael closed the door and turned to me with barely contained excitement. "Your uncle just cornered me about booking an anniversary party, and when I told him he'd need to submit a formal request to ownership, he started name-dropping you like you're some kind of powerful industry insider." He said, and I quote, "Jane has significant influence with these venue people, so I'm sure we can work something out at family rates." I laughed, though there wasn't much humor in it. "He thinks I'm an influential middleman who can get him discounts. He has no idea he's talking to one of the people who would actually approve or deny his request." "It gets better," Michael continued. "Aunt Patricia asked me directly if I knew you personally, since you'd been so helpful in arranging Emma's booking. When I said yes, she told me that you work somewhere in events, but that the family wasn't really sure what your job actually entailed." The casual dismissal stung, even though I'd expected it. My own aunt didn't know what I did for a living because she'd never bothered to ask with any genuine interest. To her, I was just Jane who worked somewhere in events, a vague description that suggested my career was too unimpressive to warrant detailed discussion. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I said that you're very well regarded in the industry and that your recommendations carry significant weight with venue management. Technically true since you are venue management." Michael grinned. "She looked pleased, like she'd finally found a use for you beyond family obligation." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the office door. Lisa entered with her clipboard and a slightly urgent expression. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, "but we have a situation developing on the terrace. Some of the wedding guests are asking detailed questions about the special service being provided to table 12. Apparently, word has spread about the dom, Perignon, and the floral arrangement, and now people are wondering why one table is receiving VIP treatment while others aren't. This was exactly what I'd been hoping for: strategic disruption that would create questions without providing easy answers. Emma's guests were sophisticated enough to recognize exceptional service when they saw it, and they were curious about why 4 relative strangers were being treated like dignitaries, while the bridal party received standard premium service. "What kind of questions are they asking?" I inquired. "Mostly wondering if table 12 includes some kind of VIP guests they weren't aware of," Lisa replied. "One of the bridesmaids asked me directly if there were celebrities or industry executives at that table that warranted special treatment. I told her that management occasionally recognizes guests who show particular appreciation for the venue's artistry, which seemed to satisfy her curiosity for now." Michael was watching me carefully. "Jane, you realize this is going to escalate, right? The more special attention you direct toward table 12, the more questions people are going to ask. Eventually, someone's going to want a real explanation for why the random guest table is being treated like royalty." "I'm counting on it," I said calmly. Emma spent cocktail hour telling her friends that I'm a charity case whose life never amounted to anything meaningful. Her bridesmaids are now wondering why the venue's management is showing special recognition to the table where that same charity case is sitting. The cognitive dissonance is going to drive them crazy. Lisa was looking between Michael and me, with growing understanding. "You want them to start asking questions about who's really at table 12? "I want them to start connecting dots," I confirmed. "Emma thinks David's family connections got them access to this venue, and she's been bragging about it all night. But she's about to discover that the real connection was sitting at the table she thought was appropriate for people who don't matter." As if summoned by our conversation, there was another knock on the office door. This time it was James, looking slightly flustered but professionally composed. "Ms. de Leon," he said, "I thought you should know that several guests have approached the bar asking about the Dom Perignon service. Specifically, they want to know if they can purchase bottles from the private reserve for their own tables." When I explained that the bottle was a gift from management, they started asking who at table 12 had warranted that level of recognition. The chain reaction was beginning exactly as I'd planned. Emma's sophisticated friends were smart enough to recognize that $400 champagne wasn't distributed randomly to tables of strangers. They were starting to wonder what they didn't know about the people the bride and groom had dismissed as unimportant. "What did you tell them?" I asked. "I said that management occasionally recognizes guests who demonstrate exceptional appreciation for the craftsmanship and artistry that goes into creating memorable experiences. I also mentioned that the decision came from ownership level, not standard service protocols." Michael was shaking his head with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You're systematically undermining Emma's narrative about who matters and who doesn't at her own wedding. She's about to realize that the table she thought was for nobodies is actually receiving the kind of treatment reserved for VIPs. She made her choice about where I belonged," I said, checking my watch. "Now she gets to live with the consequences of that choice. How much time do we have before the reception starts winding down?" Lisa consulted her timeline. "The band plays until 11, which gives us about 90 minutes. Most guests will probably start leaving around 10:30, after the bouquet toss and final dances." "Perfect," I said, opening my purse and retrieving the folder of documents Michael had prepared. "That gives me enough time to let the questions build to a crescendo before providing any answers." Emma wanted to treat me like someone whose life was too insignificant to matter. She's about to learn exactly how significant my life really is, and exactly whose success made her perfect wedding possible. The office fell silent as the three of them absorbed the full scope of what I was orchestrating. This wasn't just about revealing my ownership of the venue. It was about systematically dismantling every assumption Emma had made about my worth, my success, and my place in the family hierarchy. By the time the evening was over, she would understand exactly what she'd done and exactly who she'd been underestimating. But first, I was going to let her enjoy the rest of her reception in blissful ignorance, while her guests grew increasingly curious about why the management of her dream venue was treating her failure of a cousin like visiting royalty. The execution phase was well underway, and the escalation was about to begin in earnest. Part 4. The Revelation and Consequences. I returned to table 12 with the folder tucked discreetly in my purse, but the atmosphere had shifted dramatically in the 20 minutes I'd been gone. Marcus, Sarah, and Tom were deep in animated conversation about the extraordinary treatment they'd been receiving, and I could see that other wedding guests were stealing glances in our direction with barely concealed curiosity. "Jane," Marcus said as I sat down, "we've been trying to figure out what's going on here. The champagne, the flowers, the managing partner knowing you by name. This isn't normal wedding guest treatment. Sarah thinks you might be some kind of industry insider, and Tom's convinced you're related to the venue owners somehow." I smiled and took a sip of the Dom Pérignon, savoring both the expensive champagne and the delicious irony of the situation. "What makes you think any of those things?" "Because," Sarah said, leaning forward conspiratorially, "I've been to a lot of high-end events, and I've never seen service like this directed toward random guests. The staff is treating our table like we're visiting dignitaries or major donors. Either there's something special about one of us that we don't know, or there's something special about one of us that we do know but haven't been talking about." Tom was nodding in agreement. "Plus, I've been watching the other tables, and nobody else is getting anything close to this level of attention. The bridal party is getting excellent service, but it's standard premium wedding service. What we're getting is something else entirely. It's personal, it's exclusive, and it's clearly coming from the top." Before I could respond, Jessica appeared at our table with 2 of Emma's other bridesmaids. She was wearing the kind of bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and I could see the calculation behind her friendly approach. "Hi there," she said, addressing the table generally, but looking directly at me. "I'm Jessica, Emma's maid of honor. We couldn't help but notice that you all seem to be having an amazing time over here. The staff has been giving you some really special treatment tonight." Marcus raised his champagne flute with a grin. "It's been incredible. We were just trying to figure out what we did to deserve Dom Pérignon from the venue's private reserve." "That's so interesting," said one of the bridesmaids, a redhead, whose dress probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. "We were wondering the same thing. It's unusual for venues to single out individual tables for that kind of recognition, especially tables that aren't part of the immediate wedding party." Jessica's smile was getting more strained by the moment. "Jane, you mentioned earlier that you work in events, right? Do you have some kind of special relationship with this venue that might explain the VIP treatment?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I could feel the entire table waiting for my response. This was the moment I'd been orchestrating all evening, the point where Emma's carefully constructed narrative about my insignificance would start to crumble under the weight of evidence that contradicted everything she'd told her friends. "You could say I have a relationship with the venue," I said carefully, enjoying the way Jessica's eyes sharpened with interest. "I'm very familiar with their standards and their approach to hospitality." "But what kind of relationship?" the redhead pressed. "Are you a preferred vendor? A frequent client? Someone who brings them a lot of business?" Tom was watching the exchange with the keen interest of someone who sensed drama developing. "Actually," he said, "now that I think about it, Jane knew an awful lot about the venue's restoration process during dinner. She was telling us details about the architectural work and the design choices that seemed pretty insider level." Sarah nodded enthusiastically. She knew things about the conservatory's stained glass and the garden's landscaping that you wouldn't get from a standard tour. It was like she'd been personally involved in the renovation process. Jessica's expression was shifting from curious to concerned as she processed this information. Emma had spent months planning this wedding, and if there was some kind of family connection to the venue that she didn't know about, it could be embarrassing. Especially since she'd been bragging to everyone about David's supposed family connections being responsible for their access to such an exclusive location. "Jane," Jessica said, her voice taking on a more serious tone, "is there something about your connection to this venue that Emma should know about? Because she's been telling everyone that David's family connections were what made this booking possible, and if there's actually a family connection on her side." The moment of truth had arrived, but before I could respond, Michael appeared. At our table again, this time carrying an elegant leather portfolio and wearing the kind of expression that suggested serious business. "Ms. de Leon," he said formally, "I apologize for interrupting your evening again, but we've received the written request from your family members regarding their anniversary event. Given your position with the venue, we'll need your approval before proceeding with any special arrangements." The table fell completely silent. Jessica's mouth actually dropped open slightly, and the two bridesmaids exchanged glances that clearly communicated their shock. Marcus was staring at me with dawning comprehension, while Sarah looked like she was trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly revealed itself to be far more complex than she'd imagined. "My position with the venue?" I repeated, as if clarifying the statement for everyone's benefit. "Yes, as co-owner and creative director," Michael said, apparently oblivious to the bombshell he'd just dropped. "Your uncle submitted a request for the same family discount you approved for tonight's event, but he seems to be under the impression that you're some kind of industry intermediary rather than one of the venue's principals." The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Jessica was staring at me with a mixture of confusion and dawning horror, clearly trying to reconcile this information with everything Emma had told her about my supposed failures and lack of accomplishment. The bridesmaids looked like they were witnessing a car accident in slow motion, unable to look away from the disaster unfolding before them. Tom was the first to find his voice. "You own this place?" he asked incredulously. "You're the co-owner of Rosewood Gardens?" "I am," I said simply, enjoying the way the admission sent visible shockwaves through the group of women who'd been listening to Emma disparage my life for months. Marcus was shaking his head in amazement. "That explains everything. The VIP, treatment, the insider knowledge about the restoration, the way the staff keeps referring to ownership and management. You weren't just a random guest getting special treatment. You were the owner hosting your own family's event." Sarah raised her champagne flute again, this time in a toast. "To Jane, who apparently owns one of the most exclusive wedding venues in the region and has been far too modest to mention it until now." But Jessica wasn't celebrating. She was looking increasingly pale as the implications of this revelation sank in. "Jane," she said slowly, "does Emma know about this? Does she know that you own the venue where she's having her wedding?" "Emma doesn't know," I confirmed. "She thinks David's family connections got them access to this venue, and she's been quite happy to take credit for landing such an exclusive location through her sophisticated social network." The redhead bridesmaid was staring at me with something approaching horror. "But if you own the venue, then the discount they got came from me," I finished. "Emma and David paid $18,000 for a package that normally costs $32,000. I approved a $14,000 family discount, which made it possible for them to afford a venue that was, in Emma's words, supposed to be impossible to get into." Jessica looked like she might be sick. As Emma's maid of honor and closest friend, she'd been present for many of the conversations where Emma had dismissed my life as a series of disappointments and failed ambitions. She'd laughed along when Emma described me as someone who'd never figured out how to make something of herself, someone whose greatest achievement was knowing people in the service industry who could arrange discounts. "Oh my God," Jessica whispered. "Emma has no idea. She's been telling everyone that David's family pulled strings to get them this venue, and all this time it was actually her charity case cousin who works somewhere in events and never accomplished anything meaningful, I said, repeating Emma's words from the cocktail hour conversation I'd recorded. Yes, I heard her describing my life to you and your friends earlier this evening. It was quite enlightening to learn how my own family really sees me. The color drained completely from Jessica's face as she realized I'd overheard Emma's cruel assessment of my life. Jane, I'm sure she didn't mean... She meant every word, I said calmly. And she said it in the venue I own, at the wedding I made possible, while sitting at the head table and relegating me to sit with strangers, because she didn't think I was sophisticated enough for her crowd. Michael was still standing beside our table, professional enough not to react visibly to the family drama unfolding before him, but clearly aware that he'd walked into something significant. Should I tell your uncle that you'll be handling his anniversary request personally? He asked. Please do, I said, opening my purse and retrieving the folder of documents I'd prepared. And please give him this comprehensive breakdown of what Emma and David actually paid for their wedding versus what it would have cost without the family discount I approved. I think Uncle Robert will find it very educational, especially since he's been assuming that my connection to your venue is purely professional, rather than proprietary. Jessica watched in horrified fascination as Michael accepted the folder. You're going to tell them tonight? At Emma's wedding? I'm going. To tell them the truth, I corrected. Emma made her choice about how to treat me, and she made it publicly, in front of her friends, using my perceived failures as entertainment. She decided I belonged at table 12 with the people who don't matter. Now she gets to learn exactly who made her perfect wedding possible, and exactly whose success she's been celebrating while treating them like a charity case. The two bridesmaids were exchanging panicked glances, clearly realizing that they'd been complicit in Emma's disparagement of someone who turned out to be far more successful than any of them had imagined. The redhead cleared her throat nervously. Jane, I hope you know that when Emma was talking about your career earlier, she wasn't trying to be cruel. She just didn't know about your business success, and sometimes people make assumptions. She wasn't making assumptions, I said firmly. She was making judgments. There's a difference between not knowing the details of someone's life and deciding that their life isn't worth knowing about. Emma chose to see me as someone whose accomplishments were too minor to matter, someone whose presence was tolerated rather than valued. She made that choice repeatedly, over years, and tonight, she made it publicly. Michael cleared his throat diplomatically. I'll deliver this information to your family members and let them know you'll be available to discuss their anniversary request at their convenience. Is there anything else you need from me this evening? Actually, yes, I said, standing up from the table and smoothing my navy dress. I'd like you to prepare the comprehensive press package we put together for industry publications. Include the Millbrook magazine feature, the 5-star reviews, and the financial overview showing our booking rates and client satisfaction scores. I have a feeling my family is going to want to understand exactly what kind of business they've been underestimating. As Michael headed back toward the office, I could feel the eyes of everyone at nearby tables turning toward our group. Word was spreading through the reception that something significant was happening at table 12. And the sophisticated guests Emma had invited were smart enough to sense drama when it was unfolding in front of them. Jessica was wringing her hands nervously. Jane, I think maybe I should go find Emma and David and let them know about this before anyone else does. This is going to be a shock for them, and they should hear it from family rather than from gossip. That's very thoughtful of you, I said. But I think Emma and David are entitled to enjoy the rest of their reception without worrying about family complications. They can learn the truth after they've finished celebrating in the venue I provided, for them at a substantial discount. Tom was looking at me with undisguised admiration. You've been planning this all evening, haven't you? The VIP treatment, the strategic timing, The way you've been letting the questions build without providing answers until exactly the right moment. This isn't spontaneous revelation. This is orchestrated justice. Emma spent cocktail hour describing my life as a series of failures while celebrating in the space I created, I said. She treated me like someone whose presence was a burden rather than a gift. Tonight, she learns that her perfect wedding was made possible by the person she decided wasn't worth respecting. Sarah raised her champagne flute one more time. To Jane, who turned a humiliating seating arrangement into a masterclass in strategic revelation. I've never seen anything like this. But the evening wasn't over yet. Across the heritage room, I could see Uncle Robert approaching Michael near the office entrance, clearly eager to discuss his anniversary event, and confident that his niece's supposed industry connections would make everything simple and affordable. Aunt Patricia was with him, wearing the kind of expectant smile that suggested she was already planning her own elegant celebration at family rates. Jessica was still standing beside our table, clearly torn between loyalty to Emma and growing awareness that a reckoning was coming whether she facilitated it or not. "Jane, please," she said quietly. "Emma is my best friend, and I know she can be thoughtless sometimes, but she's not a bad person. She just didn't understand who you really were." "She never tried to understand who I really was," I replied. "She decided who I was based on assumptions and stereotypes, and she was comfortable with that decision because it made her feel superior. Emma doesn't lack information about my life. She lacks interest in my life. There's a significant difference." The band was transitioning into their final set, playing the kind of romantic standards that would encourage couples to dance and create the perfect backdrop for the bouquet toss and final celebration. Emma and David were on the dance floor, lost in each other and blissfully unaware that their family dynamics were about to shift dramatically. Michael reappeared at our table, this time accompanied by Uncle Robert and Aunt Patricia, both of whom looked excited about the possibility of securing their own discounted venue booking. Uncle Robert was carrying the folder I'd prepared, though it was clear he hadn't opened it yet. "Jane," Aunt Patricia exclaimed, approaching our table with the kind of enthusiasm she usually reserved for discussing Emma's achievements. "Michael tells us you have significant influence with the venue's ownership structure. We had no idea you were so well connected in this industry." Uncle Robert was nodding approvingly. "We should have asked you for help with Emma's wedding planning from the beginning. If we'd known you had this kind of access to exclusive venues, we could have saved ourselves months of searching." I stood up to face them directly, enjoying the way their expressions were about to change when they realized exactly what kind of access I actually had. "I'm glad you're interested in learning more about my connection to Rosewood Gardens," I said. "Perhaps you should open that folder Michael gave you. I think you'll find the information quite illuminating." Uncle Robert opened the leather portfolio with the confidence of someone who expected good news, but his expression shifted quickly as he scanned the first page. "This appears to be a financial breakdown of Emma's wedding costs," he said, looking puzzled. "Why would we need to see this?" "Keep reading," I suggested. "Pay particular attention to the section that compares what Emma actually paid versus what the event would have cost without the family discount." Aunt Patricia leaned over to read along with her husband, and I watched their faces change as they processed the information. The document clearly showed that Emma and David had received a $14,000 discount, making their dream wedding affordable when it would have been financially impossible otherwise. $14,000? Aunt Patricia said, weakly. "Jane, this says the family discount saved them $14,000. How could you possibly have arranged something like that?" "Because," I said simply, "I didn't arrange the discount. I approved it, as co-owner and creative director of Rosewood Gardens." The folder fell from Uncle Robert's hands, scattering papers across the floor as he stared at me in shock. "You own this place?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I co-own this place," I confirmed. "I've owned it for 3 years. I designed the restoration, I trained the staff, I developed the service standards, and I personally oversaw every detail of Emma's wedding to ensure it would be perfect. The venue that Emma thinks David's family connections got them access to? I built it. Aunt Patricia was looking around the heritage room with new eyes, taking in the crystal chandeliers, the restored hardwood floors, the garden doors that opened onto the terrace. All of this, she said slowly. You created all of this? Every detail, I confirmed. From the color of the paint on the walls to the variety of roses in the garden beds. This isn't just a venue to me. It's my life's work, my artistic vision made real. And Emma celebrated her wedding here while treating me like someone whose life was too insignificant to matter. Uncle Robert was still staring at the scattered papers on the floor. But you never told us. You never said anything about owning a business, about being successful, about any of this. You never asked, I said simply. Every family gathering, every conversation, every opportunity to show genuine interest in my life, you chose to make assumptions instead of asking questions. You decided I was someone whose career wasn't worth discussing, someone whose accomplishments weren't worth celebrating. Tonight, you've learned exactly what you chose not to know. The moment was interrupted by the band's announcement that it was time for the bouquet toss, and Emma's voice calling for all the single ladies to gather on the dance floor. But none of the women standing around table 12 moved toward the celebration. We were all frozen in the aftermath of revelations that had changed everything about how this family understood itself. Jessica was the first to break the silence. I have to go tell Emma, she said quietly. She needs to know about this before she hears it from someone else. Tell her whatever you think is best, I said. But tell her the truth. Tell her that her charity case cousin owns the venue where she had her dream wedding, and that the person she thought wasn't sophisticated enough to sit with her friends is the reason any of this was possible. As Jessica hurried away toward the dance floor, Aunt Patricia reached out tentatively to touch my arm. Jane, I don't know what to say. We had no idea you were so successful, so accomplished. Why didn't you ever tell us? I looked at her with the same calm expression I'd maintained all evening. Because I learned a long time ago that my family wasn't interested in my success unless it could benefit them. Tonight proved that assumption correct. The moment you learned about my connection to this venue, your first thought was how to use it for your own anniversary party. You didn't ask about my business, my achievements, or my happiness. You asked about discounts. Uncle Robert was gathering the scattered papers from the floor, his movements slow and deliberate. We made mistakes, he said finally. We made assumptions about your life that we had no right to make. You made choices, I corrected. And now you have to live with the consequences of those choices. Emma wanted to treat me like someone whose presence was tolerated rather than valued. She succeeded. But she also learned that the person she decided wasn't worth respecting was the reason her perfect wedding was possible at all. The bouquet toss was happening on the dance floor, with Emma laughing as she prepared to throw her flowers to the eager crowd of single women. From across the room, I could see Jessica approaching the bridal party, her expression serious as she prepared to deliver news that would fundamentally change how Emma understood this entire evening. But that confrontation would have to wait. For now, I was standing in the venue I'd built, surrounded by the beauty I'd created, finally visible to the family who'd spent years treating me like I was invisible. The revelation was complete, and the consequences were just beginning. Part 5. The Resolution and Transformation. The bouquet toss ended with squeals of delight from the dance floor, but I barely noticed the celebration. I was watching Jessica weave through the crowd toward Emma, her face pale with the weight of the truth she was about to deliver. Meanwhile, Uncle Robert and Aunt Patricia stood beside table 12 in stunned silence, still processing the magnitude of what they'd just learned about their niece's hidden success. Emma caught the bouquet herself in a playful moment, laughing as she held the white roses and eucalyptus above her head in mock triumph. She looked radiant, completely absorbed in the joy of her perfect wedding day, with no idea that her entire understanding of how this celebration had come to be was about to crumble. I watched Jessica approach the bridal party with the kind of determined expression that comes before delivering devastating news. She pulled Emma aside from the group, speaking quietly but urgently near the edge of the dance floor. At first, Emma's expression was simply curious, but as Jessica continued talking, I could see confusion creeping across her features, followed by disbelief, then something approaching horror. Emma's eyes searched the room until they found me, standing beside table 12 with her parents. Even from across the heritage room, I could see the shock on her face as she processed what Jessica was telling her. She said something sharp to her maid of honor, gesturing toward our table with obvious agitation. Jessica nodded grimly and said something else that made Emma's face go completely white. "She's finding out now," Tom observed quietly from his seat at our table. "And she doesn't look happy about it." Marcus was shaking his head in amazement. "I can't imagine learning that you've been disparaging someone's life and accomplishments while celebrating in a venue they own. That's gotta be one of the most humbling experiences possible." Sarah raised her nearly empty champagne flute. "It's also one of the most perfectly orchestrated revelations I've ever witnessed." Jane didn't just tell them the truth. She made them discover it piece by piece until the reality was undeniable. Aunt Patricia was still staring around the room as if seeing it for the first time. "Jane, this place is extraordinary. The attention to detail, the seamless service, the way everything works together to create something magical. You built all of this?" "Michael and I built it together," I said. "He provided the capital and business expertise. I provided the vision and operational knowledge. But yes, every aesthetic choice, every service standard, every element that makes this venue special came from my planning and implementation." Uncle Robert had finished collecting the scattered papers and was holding the folder against his chest like a shield. "We owe you an apology," he said quietly. "More than an apology. We owe you respect, recognition, and probably years of better treatment than you received from us." Before I could respond, Emma was striding across the heritage room toward our table, her wedding dress flowing behind her and her face set in an expression of barely controlled emotion. David was following a few steps behind, looking confused and concerned, but clearly not yet fully informed about what was happening. Emma stopped directly in front of me, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Is it true?" she demanded, her voice tight with emotion. "Jessica says you own this venue. She says you're the one who gave us the discount, who made all of this possible. Is that actually true?" "It's true," I confirmed calmly. "I co-own Rosewood Gardens with Michael. Chen. I designed the restoration, I oversee the operations, and I personally approved your booking at a significant family discount." Emma's face was cycling through emotions too quickly to track. Shock, embarrassment, anger, confusion, and something that might have been shame. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice cracking slightly. "Why did you let me think it was David's family connections? Why did you let me go on thinking that my life was a series of failures and disappointments?" I finished. "Because that's what you wanted to think, Emma. You never asked about my career with genuine interest. You never showed curiosity about my accomplishments. You decided I was someone whose life wasn't worth knowing about, and you were comfortable with that decision because it made you feel superior." David stepped forward, clearly trying to understand the situation. "I'm sorry, I'm not following this completely. Emma, you said your cousin worked in events, but you never mentioned that she owned a venue, especially not this venue. Because I didn't know," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never bothered to ask what kind of events she worked on, or where, or what her actual job responsibilities were. I just assumed." "You assumed I was unsuccessful because it fit your narrative about yourself," I said. "You needed to be the accomplished one, the one who figured out how to make something of herself, the one who married well and lived in the right neighborhood and had the right connections. My success would have complicated that story, so you chose not to see it. Aunt Patricia was watching the exchange with growing distress. Emma, what is Jane talking about? What narrative? Emma's composure was beginning to crack under the weight of her family's attention. I may have said some things about Jane's career that weren't entirely fair, she admitted reluctantly. What kind of things? Uncle Robert asked, his voice taking on the stern tone I remembered from childhood when one of us was in serious trouble. Emma looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape route from the conversation. I just said that she worked in events, but that it wasn't really a serious career, that she'd never really accomplished anything meaningful. I didn't know about any of this, she gestured helplessly around the heritage room. You said I was a charity case, I added quietly. You told your friends that I was someone who'd never figured out how to make something of herself. Someone whose greatest achievement was knowing people in the service industry who could arrange discounts. You said people like us don't get into places like this, and that I was probably perfectly happy with my little apartment and my little job because I didn't have any real ambitions or dreams. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the distant sound of the band seemed muted as my family absorbed the full scope of Emma's cruelty. Uncle Robert was staring at his daughter with an expression of profound disappointment, while Aunt Patricia looked like she might cry. Emma, David said slowly, you told me that Jane was helpful in getting us this venue, but you made it sound like she just knew someone who could get us a small discount. You never mentioned that she might be someone important in the industry. Because I didn't think she was, Emma said defensively. She never talked about her work in any detail, never mentioned owning a business or being successful. How was I supposed to know? You could have asked, I said simply. At any point, in the last 3 years, during any family gathering or conversation, you could have shown genuine interest in my life instead of making assumptions about it. You could have treated me like someone whose experiences might be valuable instead of someone whose presence was tolerated out of obligation. Tom was watching the family drama unfold with the fascination of someone witnessing a social experiment in real time. This is incredible, he murmured to Marcus. She's not just revealing her success, she's revealing years of family dynamics that were based on completely false assumptions. Michael appeared at the edge of our group, approaching with the careful diplomacy of someone who recognized that he was witnessing a private family reckoning in a public space. I'm sorry to interrupt, he said quietly, but we're approaching the end of the evening's timeline. Should I proceed with the standard closing procedures, or would you prefer to handle anything differently given the circumstances? I looked around at my family. Uncle Robert clutching the folder of financial documents, Aunt Patricia trying not to cry, Emma standing in her wedding dress with her perfect day irrevocably changed by the truth about who had made it possible. They all looked shell-shocked, overwhelmed by revelations that had fundamentally altered their understanding of themselves and their relationships. Proceed with the standard timeline, I told Michael. This is still Emma's wedding day, and she deserves to end it with the same elegance and beauty that defined the entire celebration. Emma's eyes filled with tears at my words. Jane, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to apologize for this. I've been so wrong about everything. About you. About your life. About what you've accomplished. You don't need to apologize tonight, I said gently. Tonight is your wedding day, and it should end with joy and celebration, not family recriminations. We can talk about everything else later, when you've had time to process what you've learned. But Emma was shaking her head, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. No, I need to say this now. I need you to know that I'm sorry, truly sorry, for how I've treated you. You gave me my dream wedding. You made this entire day possible, and I repaid you by treating you like someone whose life didn't matter. That's unforgivable. It's not unforgivable, I said, but it is something we need to work through together. The question is whether you're willing to see me differently going forward, or whether this changes nothing fundamental about how our family operates." Uncle Robert stepped forward, his expression serious. "It changes everything," he said firmly. "Jane, we owe you years of better treatment, better recognition, better respect for what you've accomplished. We've been blind to your success because we were comfortable with our assumptions about who you were supposed to be." Aunt Patricia was nodding through her tears. "We treated you like someone who needed our help instead of someone who was capable of helping us. We saw you as the family member who hadn't quite figured things out, when you were actually the one who'd figured everything out perfectly." The band was playing their final song, a romantic ballad that would traditionally signal the end of the reception. Around us, other wedding guests were beginning to gather their belongings and say their goodbyes, but our family circle remained frozen in the aftermath of revelations that had changed everything. David put his arm around Emma's shoulders, offering comfort as she struggled with the weight of what she'd learned about herself. "Emma, we can figure all of this out together," he said quietly. "The important thing is that you know the truth now, and you can build better relationships going forward." "But how do I build a better relationship with someone I've spent years diminishing?" Emma asked, looking at me with genuine anguish. "How do I apologize for being so blind, so cruel, so dismissive of everything you've accomplished?" "You start by seeing me as I actually am instead of as you assumed I was," I said. "You start by asking questions instead of making judgments. You start by treating me like someone whose experiences and accomplishments have value." Emma nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "I want to do that. I want to learn about your business, your vision for this place, what it took to create something this beautiful. I want to understand who you really are instead of who I decided you were." Marcus stood up from his chair and raised his champagne, flute one final time. "To Jane de Leon," he announced, his voice carrying across our corner of the Heritage Room, "who turned what could have been a humiliating evening into a masterclass in dignity, strategic thinking, and the power of truth. This has been an honor to witness." Sarah and Tom joined the toast, along with Uncle Robert and Aunt Patricia. Even Emma raised her hand, though she was still crying too hard to speak clearly. Around us, other guests who had been watching the drama unfold began to applaud, though they likely didn't understand exactly what they were celebrating. As the applause died down, Michael stepped forward with a final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Rosewood Gardens and our entire staff, thank you for sharing this beautiful celebration with us tonight. We hope your experience here has been everything you dreamed it would be." The reception was officially over, but our family wasn't ready to disperse. We stood together in the Heritage Room as other guests began to leave, still processing the magnitude of what had been revealed and what it meant for our relationships going forward. "Jane," Aunt Patricia said quietly, "would you be willing to have lunch with us next week? Not to talk about anniversary parties or family discounts, but just so we can learn about your life, your business, what you've built here. We want to understand who you really are." "I'd like that," I said, and I realized I meant it. The anger and hurt were still there, but they were balanced now by the possibility of genuine relationships built on truth rather than assumptions. Emma approached me hesitantly, her wedding dress rustling softly as she moved. "Jane, I know I don't deserve it, but would you be willing to show me around the venue? Not as someone planning an event, but as someone who wants to understand what you've created here. I want to see this place through your eyes." I looked at my cousin, still beautiful in her wedding dress, but with her perfect day forever marked by the truth about how it had been made possible. She looked genuinely contrite, genuinely interested in making amends, genuinely curious about the life she'd spent years dismissing. "I'd be happy to give you a tour," I said. "But not tonight. Tonight you should go home with your husband and remember the joy of this day. The business conversations can wait. As the heritage room emptied around us, I found myself standing with my family in the space I'd created, finally visible to them as the person I'd always been. The venue looked exactly as beautiful as it had all evening, but the atmosphere was different now, charged with possibility instead of hidden resentment. Tom was the last of my table mates to leave, shaking my hand with genuine admiration. "That was the most elegant demonstration of personal power I've ever witnessed," he said. "You didn't destroy anyone. You didn't create a scene. You just revealed the truth and let the consequences speak for themselves." After he left, it was just my family and the Rosewood Gardens staff beginning their closing procedures. Michael was coordinating with the catering team and the band, Lisa was managing the breakdown of the floral arrangements, and James was securing the bar area. Everything was proceeding with the seamless efficiency I'd spent years perfecting. "Jane," Emma said softly, "thank you for not ruining my wedding. You could have told everyone the truth during dinner or during the ceremony, or at any point when it would have overshadowed everything else. You could have humiliated me the way I humiliated you, but you didn't." "That's not who I am," I said simply. "I wanted you to learn the truth, not to destroy your happiness. Those are very different goals." Uncle Robert was looking around the heritage room one last time before we all headed home. "This place is remarkable, Jane. What you've built here, the vision you've executed, the standard of excellence you've maintained, it's extraordinary. We're proud of you, and we should have been saying that for years." As we finally began to leave the venue, I realized that this evening had given me something I'd been seeking without fully understanding what it was. Not revenge, not vindication, but visibility. For the first time in years, my family saw me as I actually was instead of as they'd assumed I was. They saw my success, my capabilities, my worth as a person whose life had meaning and value. The transformation was complete, but it wasn't just about me. Emma would have to reconcile her perfect wedding with the knowledge that it had been made possible by the person she'd spent years diminishing. Uncle Robert and Aunt Patricia would have to rethink their assumptions about success and family dynamics. David would have to understand that his wife's family was more complex and accomplished than he'd been led to believe. But most importantly, I would have to decide what kind of relationships I wanted to build with family members who finally saw me clearly. The anger and hurt wouldn't disappear overnight, but they could be balanced by the possibility of genuine respect and authentic connection. As I drove home from Rosewood Gardens, I thought about Table 12 and how different the evening had turned out from what Emma had planned. She'd meant to diminish me by seating me with strangers, but instead, she'd created the perfect stage for my revelation. She'd meant to celebrate her success while minimizing mine, but instead, she'd learned that her success had been made possible by mine. The silent partner was silent no more. The invisible family member was finally visible. And the woman who'd been treated like her life didn't matter had proved that her life mattered more than anyone had imagined. Tomorrow, there would be conversations about rebuilding relationships, about anniversary parties, about the future of our family dynamics. But tonight, I was simply Jane DeLeon, co-owner of Rosewood Gardens, driving home from a wedding I'd made, possible while finally being seen for who I truly was. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.